Okay, if I could ask for your attention, good morning and welcome. My name is Paul Grogan. I'm the president of the Boston Foundation, and it is a great pleasure to have all of you here this morning. I see many familiar faces, although many of you may be coming to our new space here on the third floor for the first time, and we're really excited about all the capacity of this space and the amenities and our ability to hold meetings of varying sizes, including this quite large one. For those of you who are here for the first time, I want to give you a particularly warm welcome and hope that this is the first of many visits to the Boston Foundation, which, as you know, is Greater Boston's community foundation, a 102-year-old charity that over its life has provided nearly $2 billion in grants to Boston area nonprofits working in a wide variety of fields. But we're particularly proud that $1 billion of that $2 billion has happened in just the last 10 years of the 102 years. In addition to our grant making, we are very interested in philanthropy generally, and in making the contribution that we can to expanding charitable capital that's available to this community. When Bostonians give money away, good things happen, great institutions and programs are built. And in that vein, I want to remind everyone today that today is Giving Tuesday, a national day of focus on charitable giving, and we hope that you're going to take the time to support organizations that you care about at whatever level. To assist you in this, we have created the Giving Common, which is a web-based directory of nonprofit organizations which contains detailed profiles of over 1,100 nonprofit organizations, and you are able to make gifts with your credit card through the Giving Common, which can be found at givingcommon.org. It's a marvelous resource, and urge you to take a look. This is one of our Understanding Boston forums. As you know, we put on a quite substantial number of these programs every year in an attempt to help our community define its challenges and opportunities and act on them. And housing is something that we have stayed with over 15 years, but it obviously is an issue that excites more than casual interest, judging by the turnout. And we know that some things have changed in the intervening year, but other things have stayed the same, and Professor Bluestone will take us through that. But I do want to say in advance of his remarks that the city of Boston deserves particular praise, as is given in the report, for the level of effort and success that the city proper is having in meeting the housing crisis. But they can't do it alone, and unfortunately, the commitment of our core city is not matched by really any other community in the metropolitan area, and therefore, as long as that remains the case, it's hard to imagine that we will get a handle on the problem and moderate housing prices the way we need to. So this remains a very urgent topic, even as very good things have happened. I can't help also by saying that events in Washington are going to matter a great deal to what we are able to do in the housing field. We have enjoyed for 30 plus years the low-income housing tax credit, which was created as part of the Tax Reform Act of 1986. It accounts for over 90% of the affordable rental housing being created in the United States, and the housing credit has been vital to Boston's housing efforts. And unfortunately, both the Senate and the House tax proposals in Washington would do very serious damage to those programs and sharply reduce what the credit is able to support. So in addition to acting locally and regionally the way we need to gather support for doing more, we need to keep our eye on things in Washington and prevent any loss of the low-income housing tax credit. Now it's my pleasure to introduce someone who truly needs no introduction for those of us who have been part of these forums over the years. But something has changed there as well. Professor Barry Bluestone is now, in addition to his academic appointment at Northeastern University, is a senior fellow at the Boston Foundation. And it is just delightful to have Barry as part of the team. And his indispensable work will be on display in just a moment. Please welcome Barry Bluestone.
Thank you very much. Thanks for everybody coming out today. I was on a plane flying back from my old hometown of Detroit the other day, and the chief flight attendant got on and gave us all our safety instructions. And he said, for those of you who have not been in an American car since 1954, let me instruct you on how to put on your seatbelt. Put on your seatbelts. We are going to be on quite a trip for the next 20 minutes. This is the 15th annual report card. We began this in 2002 after Ted Carman and Eleanor White, who are here, were working with us on a whole bunch of issues which later became Chapter 40R and 40S. But we've kept track of what's going on in Greater Boston in terms of our housing. And unfortunately, while we have some very good news to suggest, as Paul did, we also know there's a lot of work to be done. So here we go. We'll start with the economy. I'm an economist by training, so we follow this very closely. And the fact is that Massachusetts, and particularly Greater Boston, now has the strongest economy in the United States. The red bars here represent the growth in the economy each year in Massachusetts versus the United States, and you'll see that virtually 7 out of the last 8 years we've done better than the United States in terms of economic growth, and in the 8th year we were tied. As a result of that growth, just since 2009, just 8 years ago, we've added more than 350,000 jobs in Massachusetts. That's an 11.2% increase. And as a result, we are now at what most economists would consider full employment. In fact, the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston now considers us actually a little bit below a full employment. That is, our unemployment rate is too low. We have a tight labor market in so many occupations that it's difficult for firms to find enough workers to meet their needs. The result of a very tight labor market is that we finally have seen some wage improvement in real dollars, but the problem is it's still too little to take advantage of our housing market because average wages, even though they've gone up the last year, are still only 10% higher than they were a decade ago. Right? But at the center of all this is Greater Boston, the urban core, Boston, Somerville, Cambridge. And what we find in Greater Boston, 147 communities in 5 counties, Essex, Middlesex, Norfolk, Plymouth, and Suffolk, is we've had 284,000 new jobs 2010. That's 83% of the total new jobs in the entire Commonwealth are right here. And that's why housing is so important, because, while we've seen a little bit of growth in employment on the Cape, we've seen a little bit of growth in employment in the western part of the state. All of it, for the most part, is occurring here. So what's the challenge of a strong economy? One is that a strong economy like this, despite the high cost of living, continues to attract workers. We keep workers here who would have migrated away from Massachusetts a decade or 2 decades ago. And of course, we're attracting huge numbers of people, and particularly young people, young millennials, graduate students of mine who came here from all over the world and are now staying here because it's such a strong market. We're getting young professionals, interns, residents at our major teaching universities, not only coming here, but wanting to stay here to take advantage of this strong economy and everything else that our region has to offer. The problem is that with that increase in employment, increase in population, increase in the number of households, is far outstripping the supply of new housing. And therefore, despite our great efforts, particularly in the city of Boston, we keep falling further behind in terms of our supply of housing. And therefore, as you'll see, housing prices continue to rise. This morning's report from the Warren Group said, we have had the highest price of housing ever in October of this year, and we've had 19 straight months of price increases. And therefore, what happens is not only do we have this housing shortage, but we're beginning to see people having to make strategic decisions about where they live. And as a result, we see more working families leaving the inner core, trying to seek housing in the communities around here, particularly the other urban centers. And what we'll see, as you'll see in future slides, is that we're now seeing housing prices actually rising faster in the communities that had the lowest price housing as the pressure on that housing market grows. Now, what we need to do is do something about it. So, there are lots of ways you might think about doing it, but as an economist, we know that the chief way of dealing with this is build more housing. None of you in this room need to be told that. Now, we did see some rising home sales, although it stalled a little bit. It will have stalled by the end of this year by our projection. But we've seen some rising sales since 2011. Same thing for condos. Our 2-unit and triple-decker units continue to have about the same number of sales, although they make up about 40%, and that's important. Duplexes and triple-deckers make up about 40% of the housing stock in the urban core, Boston, Cambridge, Somerville, and those sales have remained strong. We do have some other communities that have done a very good job of increasing single-family homes. If you notice, they're in communities that were generally lower income, lower cost communities: Brockton, Plymouth, Lowell, Framingham, Lynn, Quincy, Haverhill. And in terms of condominium sales, of course, those are centered right here, where we've had so much more of the luxury, high-end condo production. You see the cranes all over Boston, South Boston, Cambridge, Brookline, and so forth. However, home ownership is down, actually sharply, from about 2/3 of all households own their own home to only about 60%. And the reason is young people are staying out of the home ownership market. As late as 2000, about 41% of those aged 25 to 34 own their own home. It's down to 30%. And for those 35 to 44, you would think, you know, that's the prime home buying market. That's down from 67% to 58%. And that's due to a number of factors. One, demographically, young people are coupling up later, they're having families later, and they're waiting. The other is they're heavily indebted, and with housing prices going up and student debt going up, they can't get into the market. They can't afford the down payment, let alone the monthly charges. Home prices respond to lots of things. A strong economy, rising household income, population growth, limited supply of new housing. There's also some downward pressure on housing. Household indebtedness, delayed marriage and childbearing, aging population. Same thing about rents. So we know there are a lot of factors that affect home prices and rents, and we're following those very closely. What's happened in terms of the homeowner market and why we've continued to see prices increase is that the supply of single-family homes, which has been pretty, growing slowly, now is at a point where the vacancy rate is down to 0.4%. Essentially, there's no inventory. We know from economic analysis that others have carried out, and we have carried out for Greater Boston, that you need about a 2% vacancy rate in the home ownership market to keep prices stable, so they don't rise much faster than normal inflation. We're at 1/5 that rate right now, and that means we need, more homes. We keep track of home prices. Here we use the Case-Shiller index, which is probably the best index of home prices because they're looking at the resale of the same unit. So we're keeping constant the type of house that is being on the market. And they show that we had an increase, by the end of this year, we'll have an increase of about 5% over last year. And as you can see by the right side of this chart, since the housing bust in the middle of last decade, we have seen increases that average about 5% a year. Well, when you compound that and you realize that family incomes at best are rising by 1%, you can see the nature of the problem. Here are the data from the Warren Group, and you'll see we're now up to $450,000 as the median price of a home. By the way, just to give you a bit of a shock, I was at my high school reunion, 55th high school reunion, Mumford High School, Detroit, Michigan, 3 weeks ago. And I went to the home where I grew up, a modest little bungalow, brick home, slate roof, 4 bedrooms, 2.5 baths, formal living room with a marble fireplace, a separate library with cherry interior.
That sounds very modest.
It's a modest bungalow for Detroit. Full furnished basement, 2-car garage, screened-in porch. And I'm standing in front of it, and I'm looking at it, and the gentleman comes out, because I do not look like I belong in that neighborhood. And I explained, I used to live here. He said, come on in. Turns out he's a fairly young African-American engineer at Ford. He's moved from the suburbs back into the city of Detroit. And I go through the house, and the house is more beautiful than ever. It's been updated. There are computer screens in every room. And as I'm leaving, I say, well, God, could you tell me, what did you pay for it 2 years ago? He said, oh, I had to pay top dollar. You know, it was in great shape. $38,000. The inner core dominates home and condo price appreciation here. And one of the things we did in this report is we did something which is called a home price gradient. That is, on average, what happens to home prices as you move away from the core? And I take the core to be the kind of inner 5 miles from downtown. And you'll see here this gradient, which shows that by the time you get out about 40 miles from Boston, you know, you're up in Lawrence, Lowell, out toward Worcester, prices are about half of what they are in the core, on average. There are, of course, some suburbs that are quite ritzy, further away, but in general, as you get further and further away, prices drop. You'll also see that in terms of the percentage change in price. And what you find, and this is really interesting, a little difficult to immediately interpret this, but what I did is I looked at James UC, my partner in crime here, co-author of this report, and I looked at the home price gradient over the period 2009 to 2017, that is the price appreciation in that time, versus just the last 3 years, 15 through 17. And what we found is that the price gradient is flattening. You'll see the red line, which is the early period, the green bars are the bottom. And what that means is that ratio has gone from 2.56, close in to 40 miles out, to 1.77, which is an indication that home prices further and further away from the core are rising faster as people move there and put pressure on that housing market. So we have a terrible problem in that the biggest pressure now is actually not in Boston. The greatest pressure is outside of Boston. Okay, we see the same thing in condominiums, except the price gradient there is getting steeper as, you know, everybody wants to come to condos on the seaport. And if you can afford, you know, $20 or $30 million for a unit, unlike my little house in Detroit, that's where you want to be. Price appreciation has been immense since 2005. At the bottom of the crisis, you know, home prices in Boston are up 2.5 times. Cambridge, South Boston, Jamaica Plain. That's where prices have risen the fastest, right? We finally see a little bit of stabilization in condo prices, again, because we've had a lot of production of condos. And we might, in fact, be on the verge of having enough luxury condos to meet the demand. And therefore, prices aren't rising quite as quickly. What about rents? Well, rents are up again, and the reason that rents still continue to rise, although not as quickly as before, is we're still below the 6%, 5.5 to 6% vacancy rate that we need to stabilize prices. We're rising. As you can see, those last 3 bars, the vacancy rate has been rising as we get more rental housing, particularly in the city. And the result is that for the first time in many, many years, at least since 2009, we actually saw rents stabilize a bit. They're down about 3% in the inner core. That's Boston, primarily, a little bit of Cambridge and Somerville. Yet the average, even at this stabilized price, means that the average annual rent is over $35,000 a year, right? Average households have an income of about $62,000. So you're talking about the average household has an income that's just roughly a little bit, you know, less than twice what the average rent is. The other thing that we've seen is this great twist from the early period of this century, where home prices were rising much faster than rents. And then if you look all the way to the right of this bar, the green bar shows single-family home prices since 2009 are up 32%. Condo prices are up 43%, but rent is up over almost 55%. What that means is, of course, a lack of affordability. So effective rents, that's after any discounts, are up 50% faster than median renter income since earlier in the decade. What that means, of course, is rising housing cost burdens. We saw a dramatic increase between 2000 and 2011 in those renter-occupied families with that were renting who are paying more than 30% of their gross income in rent, went from about 39% to 51% in 2011. It is still over half in the latest data for 2015. We still predict about a quarter or more than a quarter are paying more than half their income in rents. This isn't, this is actual data. And about 35% of homeowners are paying more than 30% of their gross income in mortgage, interest, and taxes. Other thing that was disquieting is foreclosures are on the rise again. Part of that is because banks are actually moving forward on some of the foreclosures that were delayed. We also have a lot of people who are who have not seen an increase in their incomes. They're not able to cover all their costs of living besides housing, and housing, they lose homes. Twice as many households will lose their homes this year to foreclosure than in 2014. Okay, but let's take a look at what's happening in the older housing stock, because I've really been interested in that because I live on Trowbridge Street in Cambridge, which is about half the homes are triple deckers. And when I moved there when I got married to my wonderful late wife, Emmy, who owned the house before me, and she bought this beautiful house for $230,000. All the triple deckers on the block would be just decorated for every sports event and for Christmas. It was wonderful. Today, one triple decker across the street is that way. All the others have young people in them, right? And so I've been looking at what's happened to the triple decker prices and duplex prices. And here's the problem. There's my block. And those are the people who settled there in 1910 when they came from Italy and they came from Ireland and they came from Eastern Europe. And this was the perfect housing stock for them. It was housing that was affordable for somebody who'd been here 3 or 4 or 5 years, and then they could rent out 2 units to other family members or to neighbors from their village or their shtetl. Same housing, there they are, the residents today, okay? And if you want to know why that's so, I'm a professor at Northeastern University. It has been the fact that we've been able to attract students, and now particularly graduate students from around the world. Unfortunately, virtually all of our graduate students, with the exception of some at Harvard and MIT, are living in the community. Northeastern doesn't have a single unit of housing for graduate students. And so they're taking over the triple deckers. Some of you may have children who've done this. My son is one of them, linking up with a roommate, 2 or 3 roommates, and being able to afford a rent that a working family never could. The result is that just since 2009, if you were a brilliant investor, you wouldn't want to be in hedge funds. You'd want to be in triple deckers. The price of 1 unit in a triple decker has risen 127% since 2009. Right? And the reason for that is that the rents command that kind of investment value. And so one of the arguments we're making in this report is we need to find housing for those young people who are a larger and larger share of our population that's appropriate for them in order to free up some of the older stock, which could be, again, affordable to working families, right? Now, we do have some new housing in the pipeline, particularly here in the city. Under Sheila's direction and under Mayor Walsh's direction, there's been an enormous effort at reducing permit waiting times, and the success is enormous. Single-family home in 2014, you take a typical developer, Joe may want to talk with Joe Corcoran, may want to talk about it. You take 472 days to get a permit. Today it's down to 74 days. And for multifamily, sometimes the hardest to build, down to just about 1/4 of the time it used to take. This is good, and as a result, the city is in line to meet its demand or its goal of 53,000 units. Since 2000, nearly 22,000 units of housing has been completed, and another 22,000 permits have been approved. So we're on course to meet the 53,000 housing goal. We still have to do more with affordable housing. A lot of the housing we've built is luxury housing, and as a result, we now have to put more effort on trying to build more housing that's affordable, not just for low-income people, but increasingly for working families. And here's one of the things that shocked us. The number of permits actually rose between 2016 and 2017, but all of that was in the city of Boston. Out of 147 communities in Greater Boston, all the rest actually saw a decline in the number of housing permits issued between last year and this year, and even a decline for multifamily. So Boston went from having 29% of all the permits issued in 2016 to 41% this year. They cannot, as Paul Grogan said, do it on their own. Okay? The good news, developers have learned that the demographic change, which I'm about ready to talk about, is going to put a great demand on multifamily housing, and they're responding. We've had more than four times an increase in the multifamily housing. It's been led by places like Boston and Weymouth and Framingham and Sharon. And while only a quarter of new housing units in 2000 were in multifamily apartment type structures, it's now almost 2/3. Good news, what we're building meets the demographics. Unfortunately, as Paul suggested, public funding is on the decline. We see this in terms of the real operating funds for housing and homelessness programs in the Commonwealth. Adjusting for inflation, that's fallen for the second straight year. If, in fact, the Congress maintains its spending as it has, we're going to see a sharp downturn of almost 13% in housing spending by the federal government. And the result is nearly a 10% reduction in spending on housing and homelessness in 2018, fiscal 18, versus last year, fiscal 17. So finally, I want to conclude by talking about what are some of the things we could do about this. And this is the first report in which we're going to put out, we have put out a 10-step program for really doing something about that, right? We want to applaud some of the efforts we're seeing in trying to keep the federal low-income housing tax credits, the federal home fund programs, a 5-year capital plan that the governor announced, and we're particularly excited that the Senate passed housing legislation that would provide cities and towns with new tools for planning, zoning reform, which we desperately need. The problem is we got to get the House to pass it if we're going to get it, and we've got to get the governor to sign it. The efforts here in the city have been monumental. As I said, city land is now being made available. A new Office of Housing Stability has been created to help prevent displacement of residents from their homes. A new workforce housing tax credit has been proposed, and there's been a significant reduction in wait times, as I suggested. But what we face are these demographics. One, since just 2010, the city of Boston has seen its population increase by 55,000, and it could get up to 725,000, according to Imagine Boston 2030. If we look at Greater Boston, we're actually talking about a population increase by 2030 from 2010 of about 340,000 people, 2/3 of them outside of Boston. Much of that settling in the inner core and other regional urban centers. Think Chelsea, think Lynn, think Brockton, think Lawrence, Lowell. What will that mean in terms of housing? Well, given the smaller size of households, that means we need to create 160,000 housing units by 2030 across the Greater Boston region, 3 times the amount that Boston will do, right? So who's growing the population? In 2000, 20 to 34-year-olds made up about 1/3 of the population of Boston, Cambridge, and Somerville combined. But in the decade, 2000 to 2010, they made up 74% of the increase in the population. So that's one of the demographic groups that we need housing for, and the large single-family home in Weston is not going to fit the bill, right? In fact, if we look at the data, there are only two groups that are really going to grow between 2030. It's going to be those who are or were millennials, 25 to 44, and old folks like me, right? And that's a very different demographic than we had that built the suburbs with the single-family homes for families of 4 and 5. So we need a new kind of housing. Tamara Roy is going to talk about one form. We're going to need very little new large housing for people, families of 4 or plus. Most of it has to be smaller new units for young millennials, working families, aging baby boomers. And what we have suggested here is the idea of the 21st century village. You may have heard me talk about the millennial village in the past for young people, and then somebody in an audience said, but what about you and me? And I realized I want the same kind of housing. I want to downsize from my big home in Cambridge that my wife willed to me, and I want something that meets my needs. So what we want to do is get folks out of the old triple-decker and duplex stock, the young people, and turn that back over to the people who really need it. And we do that by providing new opportunities for young people and for us. We're calling them villages, not apartments. They're going to have lots of amenities. They're going to rebuild community, if not horizontally, vertically. Range of units in size and in quality. The lower units can be, smaller and formica. The upper units and the penthouses will be larger with granite countertops. Common shared space. Retail establishments on the first floor. Roof gardens for parties in the summer. New public transit where possible. Make it near public transit. Try and make it transit. Little parking for zip cars. I love to say, the Morris Mini for that hot date. The van when you have to go to IKEA. Storage lockers in the basement. Just some visions of what that might look like. And now finally, an inclusion. How do we do it? So getting it done, we need to have private developers come on board. They should be leading this effort, and they should be willing to build new housing at reasonable prices with a fair but not excessive return on their investment. We need our quasi-public lenders to step forward and see if we can find forms of finance for such projects. Most importantly, we need to get our universities and teaching hospitals and some of our major businesses to finally play a major role in this new collaboration. Not only marketing this to their graduate students, their interns, their residents, their young workforce, but indeed working together, let's say Northeastern, Boston University, Boston College, Suffolk getting together, working with the developer, putting up a village, and not only marketing it to their students or their interns and residents and their young workers, but actually taking collective master leases, guaranteeing full occupancy. Northeastern would take 60 units out of 300 in building 1, let's say. That to me, and when I talk with our finance people, is going to be critical, and we need to get them at the table. We need to get architects and construction firms think about new designs. We've had no improvement in building construction of homes in 70 years. We still build homes the same way. 0% increase in productivity in home construction, 300% increase in the economy as a whole, 800% increase in productivity in manufacturing over the last 70 years. So that means we have to think of a new way of building housing. And I think Tamara is going to talk a little bit about some ideas about that. We are also talking about building a manufacturing facility here for modules or panels. We could become a leader in the world in new housing design, development, and production. We could work with Madison Park High School to train our kids to build this kind of housing and build a facility that would be world-class. We need to work with the building trades, the unionized building trades, not only in terms of moderating some of the costs of labor costs, but also having some of their retirees act as trainers in this new type of housing. We need to get municipal government working on rezoning, particularly in suburban outer parts of the region. We need to eliminate or reduce parking requirements. We need to use surplus municipal-owned land. And we need to have the state government involved, bonding authority, a state tax credit, state-owned surplus property, MBTA surplus property for housing. So, 10-point program. Step 1, form a new housing task force. Number 2, do a demand study of millennials and baby boomers, which I hope to undertake this year. Where do they live now? What kind of housing do they need? What do they want? Where do they want it? 3, We need to get the governor of Massachusetts, the lieutenant governor, political leaders, the mayors, to convene a meeting of developers, construction firms, architects, designers. What will it take, the governor should ask, to make this happen? And then we should get the governor to bring together the various building trades to talk to them about working on this problem. Then get together and think about ways of creating that new forms of housing, and then most importantly, convene the university presidents, including my own, the CEOs of the major hospitals and major firms, and said, we need your help. This is what we need from you. Step 9, we need to figure out a way of getting planning officers and others to discuss publicly owned sites for such housing to reduce the land costs. Get the governor and others sitting down with the planning departments and the mayors and town officials to think about zoning reform. Step 9, sign agreements between universities, teaching hospitals, businesses, and developers. And step 10, build it. With a coordinated effort, this plan is a chance of finally meeting Greater Boston's housing needs for our young people, for working families, and for seniors. Thank you.
Thank you, Barry. You've certainly given us a lot of data and a lot to think about. Good morning, everyone. My name is Keith Mahoney. I'm the Vice President for Communications and Public Affairs here at the Boston Foundation. And I'd like to invite our esteemed panel to join me on stage to help unpack all of what we just heard. You have full biographies of the panel on your chairs. I'll do a brief introduction. Before I do that, I do want to recognize City Councilor Tim McCarthy, who's joined us from the City of Boston. Thanks for being here, Tim. All right, so starting on my far left, we have Sheila Dillon, who's the Chief Housing and Director of Neighborhood Development at the City of Boston, where she acts as advisor to Mayor Walsh on housing issues. She oversees the management of the Boston Home Center, the Neighborhood Housing Development Team, the Real Estate Management and Sales Team, and spearheads the city's efforts around housing Boston's homeless. Prior to her work in city government, Sheila was the Director of Real Estate at the Mass Housing Partnership and Director of Development at the Dorchester Bay Economic Development Corporation. Sheila received her undergraduate degree from SUNY, an MBA from Suffolk University, and an MA in psychology from Pepperdine. Next, we have Joe Corcoran, the principal of Joe Corcoran Company. Since 1985, he's been a top executive in various capacities in the real estate business. The company was formed primarily to pursue the transformation of public housing into mixed-income communities using private equity solutions. A graduate of BC, Joe is also the past president of the Builders Association of Greater Boston. Next, we have Tamara Roy, who's a principal at Stantec. Tamara was named one of Boston's top 50 power women in real estate. She also served as the president of the Boston Society of Architects in 2016. She's an architect and an urban designer specializing in multifamily, residential, academic, and commercial projects. She received her Master's of Urban Design and Architecture from the Berlage, pronouncing that right, Institute, an international think tank in Amsterdam, where she lived in a 300 square foot apartment with her husband and a newborn baby. And closest to me, last but certainly not least, is Crystal Cornegay, the Undersecretary for the Massachusetts Department of Housing and Community Development. Prior to joining the Baker administration, Crystal served as Urban Edge's president and CEO. She's a 2012 graduate of the Achieving Excellence program at Harvard's Kennedy School, holds a master's in city planning from MIT, and a BA from Hunter College. So thank you for joining us this morning. I want to start with initial reactions to the report and Barry's presentation, starting with Sheila.
Thank you. It's good to be here, and thank you, Barry, for that great report. So I just, we have been working really hard. Boston's been really working hard on supply, and I feel I came prepared with some numbers because it's it's been a tough 3 or 4 months trying to talk about production, because I think, and I think I even heard it Barry say it, the thinking is, or the story out there is that Boston's building lots and lots and lots of luxury housing. And we are building some, and it's mostly downtown, and it's what you see. But of the 24,000 units that have been permitted recently, there is a mix of incomes, a housing that's available for a mix of different kinds of households. And 2,100 units that have been permitted are deed restricted, tax credited, funded by the state, funded by the city. So it's over 2,000. 2,400 of those units, an additional 2,400 units, are middle income units, deed restricted middle income units that we're getting from inclusionary development primarily. So if you'll notice, we're getting more affordable deed restricted units right now from market rate housing development than we are our traditional affordable housing delivery system. So we are extracting quite a lot of resource from the market. And about 5,000 units we are saying are market rate, I don't want to use the word affordable, but households with incomes of less than $125,000 can afford to rent or buy them. So there is a mix of incomes. It's about 40% we are non-luxury, available to something else other than people that have, you know, lots and lots of money. We're also extracting a lot of money from the portfolio, $57 million in the last couple of years, and increasing the tax base. So the production's good on for a whole host of reasons, and I just need to spend 2 minutes doing that and dispelling that it's all luxury, because it's not. Thank you for letting me do that. Oh, I've heard that so much over the last 3 or 4 months. I think Barry's right on a couple of, more than a couple, but a couple I want to highlight. There are a lot of people paying way too much money for rent. I'm not worried about everybody. If they don't have a car and they're making good income and they're in the city and they're paying 35, 40% of their income in rent, they're pretty happy. You know, they're young, they're happy, they love to be here. I am worried about the low-income households that we are tracking that are paying more than 50% of their income in rent. So we definitely need a lot more affordable housing. And we also need to figure out our home ownership piece. What we're selling is too expensive, and we need to figure out the new 21st starter home. And so the city is building a lot of affordable home ownership. We're putting a lot of money and land out to do that, but we need the market to respond as well. Where's the $400,000 something, or the $350,000 something that people can buy? So I think we really need to work on that. We just ended Mayor Walsh's first term, and I think it was pretty successful with housing. But we are thinking about 2.0. What are we going to do next? So a lot of Barry's ideas we really like, especially looking at housing production regionally and how can we all work together. So.
I think that's a good cue for you, Crystal, talking about regional work and how the city and the state can work together on solving some of these problems. So your reactions?
Well, thank you, and thank you, Sheila, for dispelling the myth around luxury housing. Yes, it's just, I spend time dispelling the myth around affordable housing, and it only being for low-income folks. Most people who live in affordable housing, especially in Greater Boston, work for a living. And when we think about what the fastest growing job sort of categories are, they are categories that really support our innovation workers, right? And so we talk a lot about millennials and baby boomers and those in the sort of medical and technology work, but there's a study that says for every innovation worker, you create 5 ancillary jobs, right? And so the innovation worker needs a doctor and a lawyer. And so we don't spend any time thinking about how they're gonna live. But the innovation worker also, you know, wants to pay $8 for a cup of coffee. So who's the barista, right? And how are we housing them? And how are we housing folks who support the doctors and lawyers? And that's what we spend a lot of time thinking about. And not necessarily that it's all about luxury or even market rate. It's like trying to figure out how to have those folks who make our lifestyles more comfortable, you know, be able to live in the inner city and Greater Boston. One of the things that I always talk about when we talk about supply and demand is people say you should build more housing. But the thing that Boston has right that comes out in the report is not just build more, but build more and build it fast, right? Because it's not just the amount, but the time that it comes on to market matters. And so we've been thinking a lot in the administration around what can we do to help those communities across the Commonwealth, but particularly in the inner core, to build more faster, right? And it's different kinds of housing, because it means that people live differently than they did, and we're not doing the big single family houses. And so we've been doing a lot of work, not just with mayors, but thinking about town managers and those other kinds of communities. And we'll be trying to put forth some things in the next month around how we might do that. The rent burden piece is not just true in the inner core, it's true all over the Commonwealth. Everywhere I go, people talk about rent burden. And people are everywhere in Massachusetts sharing in the growth of the economy at varying levels, but also being burdened by what their rents are. And part of what we've had success in, we feel like we've been an administration that's worked really hard to work with municipalities around advancing housing, also thinking about how we coordinate our efforts across the administration. And one of the things that no one really talks about is the only way you get anything permitted outside of Boston is through 40B. And so even in Cambridge and Somerville. And so one of the things that we've seen is in the most recent subsidized housing inventory, we've seen a 40% increase in the number of communities who are above their 10% in their SHI. And that has as much to do with what the administration does to support localities as it has to do with just what the market is seeing, right? And a lot of communities being sort of forced in many ways to take on development. The other thing I wanted to say is in Barry's report, it talks about the decrease in public funding, but it only talks about the operating dollars. And what we do is spend a lot of money, capital dollars, in terms of production. And while we spend operating dollars to support very low-income households and programs to help them with their rent subsidies, the capital dollars are where it's at with us in terms of how we support production and preservation of affordable housing. And then the final thing I'll say is, like, because we can't subsidize our way out of this problem, so no matter how much money Sheila and I put on the street, it doesn't, like we're never going to be able to catch up. And one of the things that Sheila's describing is, like, they're now, Boston is now getting a lot of its affordable housing out of allowing market rate housing, right? So you got to, like, have a thing of both. The innovations in construction is key. Right, like it's incredible that we're the sort of center of innovation around so many things, but we can't figure out how to do this better. And so we can have I'm now talking to developers about this, so you can either have the government tell you what to do, which I will say is a disaster, or you can figure that out yourselves, right? Like, you guys need to self-regulate around how you're going to come up with ways, because we can't continue to build at the prices that we're seeing now. So that's my reactions.
Okay. Joe, you're a developer. Crystal's talking to you here.
And it wouldn't be the first time she's beaten me up. But two reactions to the report. I think the idea of a collaborative is a great idea. I don't know if the end result is going to be Millennial Village per se, in that way, shape, or form. But it'll just study all the issues. And the big issue within that context, which was mentioned in the report too, I think, is cost. And in a development deal, 75% of the total development cost is hard. And unless we do something to kind of address and attack that, we're not going to move too far forward. Part of it is innovation, pieces of it, that's for sure. Part of it's wage rates, et cetera. But that's a key. We run into that all over the place. And it drives up the need for resources, public resources. It's a big issue. And I think the only way to come to grips with it was a collaborative. And I think the building trades would be all in for it too, because it's doing some good things. So I don't think it's but I think it needs to be a discussion that's had more than just one-on-one with me and Crystal I mean, I'd like to have more developers in the room when I talk with Crystal, because I get strength in numbers. But I think it would be good to get all those ideas out there. The second thing that was noticeable in the report to me was, I've read the report since it came out, and it doesn't seem to be there's an increase in number of communities who have a 40R zone. And I don't quite understand why. I mean, the 40R was put in place as a carrot approach because people were so concerned about 40B. And there hasn't been more of that. And it's maybe kind of drifted into the wayside. I'm doing a 40R deal right now in Amesbury. But, you know, there aren't a lot of them around. And so that's the two biggest things that I came out of reading the report.
Okay. Tamara, your reactions?
So for me, I guess I'd like to talk about the end of the report with the 21st Century Village, because I do believe that if you look at the luxury developments happening in the downtown core, that is what they are. It's an incredible mix of folks in their 20-somethings all the way up to empty nesters. With communal spaces, it's really intergenerational village, but it's at a certain wealth level, right? And so I think that your 10-point list really is trying to get at how can we do the same thing at a more affordable price point. And so you get sort of back to the cost part of it, which I think we'll talk about a little bit further in the questions, but I appreciate that. And I actually want to say, I was saying to Sheila when Barry was going through the whole report, what did we do before we had the housing report card? I mean, we take it for granted, but thank you really for doing this, because there's so much good information there that we all take for the next year and wait for the next one to come out.
I know Sheila's always eager to have the housing report card come out. And this year might be an exception. But it is a strong endorsement of the housing policies of the Walsh administration. What drove that success? And can you also talk a little bit about how having a long-term plan in Imagine Boston 2030, what effect that's going to have on housing policy in the second term?
So, the Walsh administration, when it came in, we've had a housing problem day one. And I think in the most recent election, it was always polling as the #1 problem. Housing touches everybody. So we put together a plan, and it was based working with MAPC. I don't know if they're here, but they did some really good demographic projections on population growth and what the populations were going to look like. And we put forth some numerical goals. And I think it's really important for administrations to do this, towns, city, other cities, because if they're like Boston, there's a lot of different departments that get involved in this. We've got ISD, we've got the BPDA, we've got the city, we've got D&D, we've got the mayor's office, we've got our elected officials. And if we all agree on the same, on the set of goals based on the data, then it makes it much easier rowing. Absolutely. We are looking at 2.0, like I said, and we'll probably have some updates to the plan coming up. We're looking at the data again. We're analyzing, some of our original assumptions to see if they're still accurate and they need to be modified. I think looking at Imagine Boston, which was the citywide plan, we started to look at land use in areas that we could see potential growth. And we call them strategic planning areas or growth areas. They're probably pretty similar to your villages, but where can we create something that is totally new? A good amount of housing density for lots of different populations with the right infrastructure, close to transit. I like villages better. I think it's got to probably be better than strategic planning areas. But the one thing I will put out there, though, and I think this is on cities and towns and maybe developers, is we always talk about cost as being the barrier, right? And people have heard me. They're going, oh no, here she goes. But if we get the cost down, it's great. If it's subsidized, it really impacts. But if it's market rate housing and we're getting the cost down, what's the impetus for the developers to take on those cost savings that will impact their rent levels and sales levels and pass them on to the end user? There isn't any. So I think if we're going to start talking about getting costs down, which I think we should, we also need to talk about Plan B. Why are you going to pass those savings on even if the market is dictating something else? So I just want to put that out there about costs. I think it's always a Part A conversation, but I think we need the Part B part of it.
I want to follow up something a little bit different that is related to cost, though, but one of the disturbing things in the report was the increase in foreclosure. And Crystal, I know that one of the funding items that the Baker administration increased was to expand the housing court. Can you talk a little bit about the thinking behind that? And I know people have said that that is a way of trying to alleviate the problem.
Sure. The housing court actually does a lot of work with renters as well as with foreclosures, and so and it's been very successful, right? Because housing is sort of a unique kind of time-sensitive thing, and really part of it is as much about trying to do what the city is doing around its Office of Housing Stability, and just trying to, our work with homelessness has really taught us that every tenancy matters. Right? Like, it's just so much easier to figure out how to keep people stably housed as opposed to trying to find some alternative place for them to go. And so the expansion of housing court is just to make sure that we have that resource along all across the Commonwealth as opposed to just select areas.
Great. So we talked about the need to produce cost-efficient and desirable housing. Tamara, can you talk a little bit about your work with the YooHoo and give some background on the project? I think you have some slides, and there's an advancer on the table next to you.
This is you.
So when I became president of the Boston Society of Architects in 2016, one thing that they asked me is, what's your agenda? And I said, I want to try to change people's minds about compact living, think about more density and affordability. So one of the initiatives that we did with Sheila's office, actually, the Department of Neighborhood Development and the Housing Innovation Lab, as well as a startup called Live Light, was to take this mobile 385 square foot prefab unit around to 6 different neighborhoods in the city. So if you didn't see it, you can go to, just search YouTube YooHoo Boston, and you will see a little video that we made as it was traveling around and interviews with people coming to see it. And what we heard as it was going around was that it was not only great for millennials, but also for seniors. The seniors really liked the roll-in shower. They liked the way that it was small and uncluttered, and a lot of people really told us personal stories about how they didn't like where they were living right now. It was too much maintenance. They would love to live in a place with more common space, like this. The other thing that we heard was that people wanted to live not just with millennials or just with seniors, but in intergenerational places. So that was a big key finding. Generally, 2% of the around 3,000 people who saw this unit said, I don't want to see this in my neighborhood. The other 98% said either we're cautiously optimistic, or we'd love to see it, or how much does it cost? I'd like to buy one right now. And the other piece that we were thinking of for this pilot was the cost of it and the prefab way that it was made in Pennsylvania, modular for $65,000, which is either like about a half to even 2/3. Am I getting the math right? 1/3 of what units typically cost of this size. So if we could actually have more modular construction in the city, again, as you said, it comes online faster. There's just a lot of great things to be said about this. I'm going to go next also. Another initiative we did that I'd love to talk about was the innovative housing competition, because it's one thing to talk about prototypes, but it's another thing to actually prove that there's a developer out there. And actually, we found 7 developers willing to compete for city-owned scattered sites around Boston to try to do some sort of innovative housing that involved compact living. And so this site, which was 24 Westminster in Roxbury, was won by Dream Collaborative. And Greg, if you raise your hand, fantastic job, as well as the others who competed. But what they did here, was really monumentally innovative on so many levels. So the neighboring site is a 3-family with 4 parking spaces. This site, same size lot, 12 units, 6 parking spaces. So 4 times as many units and half as many parking spaces. And then what you see here is home ownership, not rental. And there's a mixture of units, which you can see the mortgage rates on there, for intergenerational housing. So one was your typical 3-bedroom duplex on top of a 1-bedroom unit that could be bought by a family and used throughout their lifetime or rented out for income. Really fantastic in terms of the cost as well, or a 1-bedroom for a single, or a 2-bedroom for a growing family. And I had Greg and Troy into my class at MassArt, my innovative housing class, and they were asked by the students point blank, how do you know that the people who are going to buy in here are going to be the ones who are, where it's going to improve your community, which was their mission as architect developers. And Greg said that they are working with a real estate broker in Roxbury who is helping folks, multi-generational families, get their credit scores in line so that they're prepared to get these units as they come online. So amazing, like win, 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 all the way down the line. And I think that the takeaway here with this project, while it's still small, 12 units, is that the idea is it's replicable. It didn't require subsidies. It was on city-owned land, but they didn't get it for free. They had to pay for it, that land. So it's a model that we hope, can be replicated around the city.
Well,
so lastly, I actually have,
right. Keep the spontaneity going. We'll go to Joe to talk from a small project to one of the biggest projects going on in Boston. The report doesn't spend a lot of time on public housing, but One Charlestown is one of the biggest public housing renovations in the region. Can you tell me a little bit about, tell us all about how the model was developed with the BHA, how it's possible to finance a project like this?
Yes. Well, it all started with the BHA coming to the conclusion that there's no federal money capital programs that's going to come into the marketplace anytime soon, and it has an aging portfolio of public housing, which was predominantly built when the program first started in the late 1930s and the 40s and some into the 50s. And recognizing it had this old portfolio and it didn't have any federal funding coming in, and the tax credit program being strained and constrained by all the demand for it, it put out a request for qualifications, looking for ideas about how to address this problem because they didn't know what to do. And when that came out, I had a clear model in my head, which was called Harbor Point, which my father developed 25, 30 years ago, which is a mixed income community. It relies on the market rate component to pay real estate taxes, to recapitalize itself, to pay repairs, to keep it in shape. It doesn't require any public resources 30 years out. So I thought, given the fact that there's just an abundance of private capital out in the marketplace, like if you looked at the capital stack at Harbor Point back when it was built, it wouldn't look too much different than a tax credit capital stack today, because the markets didn't exist. Yet it operates like a market rate apartment complex. But the capital out there today is just, there's just so much of it looking for deals. So I thought if you could match the Harbor Point model with the capital market, you might be able to do it. I tested it with a few private equity resources, then they weren't offended by a 25, 30% low income component within a mixed income development. So I responded to the RFP, this RFQ, and I took the top 5 biggest housing developments in the portfolio. I applied this model to it. Other people responded with different ideas. Shortly thereafter, an RFP came out for the Charlestown project, which is the biggest in the BHA portfolio. It's 1,100 units, fully occupied. And I got a partner, another capital partner, and lo and behold, we won. So the idea is to create a mixed income community, increase the density. This needs to be And we thought we could do it in Boston because, Boston has been okay with increasing density throughout the city and understanding that density is a helper to the whole problem. So we'll probably be in the neighborhood of 2,500 units in four to 6-story buildings. There's one 7-story building on there that maybe we'll get maybe
shorter.
we won't. It gets shorter.
Part of the process.
It's a big project. It's gone through. It's in the maybe, depending how you look at it, either the front half or the front third of the Article 80 process. We're still working through it, engaged with the community, and hopefully by next summer we'll be out of the Article 80 process and everyone will be happy and on board, and we can start to talk about actually building the first phase. But I think the model is, trying to attract the private capital markets to the solution here, and it can be done. Private capital isn't easy to work with. I mean, it has to get its return. It has its rules, but it's a balancing act. But I think it's part of the solution. This is a specific solution, though, for public housing, federal public housing that's going to get a project-based Section 8, which really helps in the whole the feasibility of it. Not applicable everywhere, not applicable to every city, but works right here in Boston.
I think Sheila wanted to jump in. Crystal wanted to jump in on that.
Yeah, I wanted to just make sure that people understood how critical private capital is and drives this. And people don't, I think, because we talk a lot about, oh, the state needs to do X. The state just, the amount of private capital in the marketplace these days is crazy and is really driving even a lot of the preservation projects that we've had, right? So one day, 15 years ago, private markets discovered, oh my God, there's affordable housing, like I can get these kind of returns. And they started driving their money this way. And we're having all kinds of problems trying to make sure that private capital with its, it's agnostic about mission. Its mission is just to, duplicate, reproduce, right? Like that's what its mission is. And so it's sort of like trying to make sure that we understand how to get them what they sort of need and want, and to leverage that to get good outcomes for folks. It's part of the challenge that Sheila's describing, right? It's not necessarily the developers, although some of them are. I'm not gonna pretend that. Not Joe, though. But it's sort of like if they get their money from the private market is agnostic about, like, I don't care. Like, I want to make my return. And in fact, if I can make more return, I want that too. And so if we can't subsidize our way out of it, then we've got to figure out a way to deal with private capital efficiently and effectively to get to good outcomes. And we spend a lot of time thinking about, in the administration, how to make the market do what it does best, and how to make it respond to what we think the sort of needs are, without necessarily feeling like we got to subsidize everything. Because if we're creating units that we're subsidizing people at, $80,000, like we can't really help folks who are at $25,000, right? Because we're not growing the amount of money that we have for that. So anyway.
Keith, I think, the Charlestown, we've got about, I think, I'm making this number up, it's like 10 or 12. BHA has put out some RFPs so that with where there's public housing and land, and asking developers to, really think creatively about how do we use the land around to renovate the existing housing, which is really on its last legs, and get increased density and mixed income. So I think it's a really good plan. But it does require some subsidies. So while we're trying to build new affordable housing, I think sometimes we forget how much money we really do need to spend. Some of it's private, a lot of it's public, to just keep what we have in Boston's 50,000 affordable units running and running well. So there is always competing demand. So
right.
The more we can use the market, the better off we are.
Right. And we've done that. The state is one of the only states in the union that has a significant public housing portfolio. And so we've built on this model as well to try to figure out what are the markets in which we can have private capital leverage redevelopment of our public housing stock as well.
Well, you both kind of raised the elephant in the room, pun intended, that you know, the Baker administration had $72 million in housing subsidy funds, which include federal home funds. Are you concerned about the existence of that going forward? And Sheila, with you, I mean, Hope 6 grants have been very important in supporting public housing in the city of Boston. How do you know, Paul mentioned the low-income housing tax credit. How do you see this playing out with the market?
Yeah, it's a scary time, no doubt. Fiscal year 18, fiscal year 19, our federal money is going to be, we think, steady, stable. I don't see us getting Hope 6 grants, so that's why we're doing what we're doing and putting out land for redevelopment, because I don't think we're going to see a lot of Hope 6 grants in the near future. Hopefully they'll return. So we've got friends in Washington. We're watching. I was pretty impressed, you know, the last couple of weeks when the tax credit program was threatened and still remains threatened, the mobilization both in Massachusetts and you know, across the country with all of our city partners. So I think we need to remain vigilant, and I think we need to get our Boston delegation too involved. They're fighting on so many fronts. We really do need to make sure that they are also, you know, taking up the housing charge. So we can't rest, but I feel for the next couple of years, I feel like we're okay, except for the tax credits, which we have to watch really carefully.
Changing tack a little bit, and Barry mentioned this, Tamara, there haven't been any real technological breakthroughs in housing. I mean, we've had disruptive technologies change the way we drive, communicate, work. Why has this not been the case, and is it different in design than in construction? What are your thoughts on this?
You're going to end up putting me with concrete shoes in the Charles River, right, with that question.
It'll be some new technologically advanced concrete, and we can build housing around it.
Well, thank you. Well, I mean, I do think that we're, you know, it's a little slower to come here. You know, there's definitely, as we mentioned, sort of prefab and modular things happening in New York City that we could take on at a larger scale. And even I know of at least one developer here who is starting to look at actually flat pack construction, which is kind of the IKEA model, where instead of making modulars where when you stack them up, you basically have double walls, double floors, and double ceilings, which is very inefficient. Instead, you just flat pack the walls, the floors, and the ceilings, and you bring them from someplace else, and then you put them together. I think that is a disruptive technology that's interesting. And in most of our buildings, we are starting to panelize the facades and panelize bathrooms and other things, so that's happening. It's sort of under the radar. I guess another disruptive technology that I do think is completely affecting housing, but not necessarily in the delivery, is our transportation options, right? So suddenly you have Zipcar, Uber, you have hopefully better public transit, you have bike lanes. And all of these things are, thank goodness, you know, the data is just starting to show that we don't need to build all these parking spaces, which especially when you look at micro housing, you know, the size of a parking space is the same size as your unit. So, you know, we can start to convert parking spaces to units. And then I think like those are like, we think of innovations as sort of optimistic, but I do think there's this one that's been floating around here today, which is that, you know, since the recession and probably before, housing has become an investment commodity. And I think we're really feeling the impact of that. And when I interview my clients about their financing, and they start to talk about the funds that they're using to, you know, and the money that's coming in there, and the returns that are expected for some of these high-risk funds that are in the 8, 10, 12, 14% return ranges, and the fact that the developer doesn't get paid until after all of his lenders are paid. You know, this is no longer a financial, you know, equation where you're paying back a bank at 5%. you're paying these guys at really high rates. And a lot of these are trade union funds, they're teachers unions funds, there's all kinds of funds that we're, so on some level, some of us are benefiting, but on the other level, we're hurting all the rest of us. So I think that it's beyond my pay grade and my expertise to say how we handle that, but I do think that it's, we're gonna have to look pretty critically at that. And, I do, on the positive side, see that there is an incredible demand in middle income housing. And the luxury stuff was the easiest stuff to first pick off. But now, when you look at the majority of demand in our city is for middle income housing. And I do think that the free market, if we help them out and provide the right incentives, as you're talking about, we can push it toward that solution.
So, that the report sort of talks about an urban solution, and many people look to move to cities like Boston to experience diversity, yet housing costs segregate neighborhoods in a way. So Joe, Harbor Point is an example which has successfully integrated different incomes, and I know One Charlestown tries to do that. Two questions of that. What is the, with One Charlestown, what is the neighborhood response to that sort of a neighborhood that has rapidly changing demographics in Charlestown, and how does that carry on going forward?
Well, I don't think the neighborhood has a problem with the mixed income element of it. I mean, I think the neighborhood is more concerned about the typical things neighborhoods are worried about: height, density, traffic, right? So those are the things. I mean, but in terms of the mixed income piece, I mean, when Harbor Point was being developed, no one thought, the critics would say that market rate people won't in a million years live next door to those low income people. And that's just been proven wrong. And I think even today, if it was true then, it's even more true today that people don't care. And the nature of what we're trying to build here is that we're not having a segregated piece where there's the low income building beside the market rate building to accommodate, the rebuilding. Harbor Point mixes them all together. You could live next door to a low income person as a market rate person. And if a market rate person is offended by that, they have options. They can go someplace else. Right. So it is a model, and it works. And I don't think people have any problem living. I think people like living. If they want to live in a city, it's going to be an integrated and mixed income anyway. Another thing about just the market rate piece of it, just to maybe emphasize that a little bit. People who rent, there's a range of people who rent in Harbor Point and will rent in Charlestown. Some who are on the edge of struggling to afford the rent. Some who can afford the rent 10 times over. So even within the market rate, there's a whole mixture of incomes and demographics, even fueled today by the two biggest demographic groups in the United States, and certainly in Boston. That's millennials and baby boomers. I mean, we're seeing people my age who are moving down, moving to apartments, moving to the city to be in apartments. I think the price point of One Charlestown will attract people who moved out of the city, who moved back in, who might have grown up in Charlestown in the day, or grown up in the city, in the day, like I did, and your parents moved out. So I think there's people want to live in cities, and the mixed income model has proven that it works.
So I want to change tack here a little bit, and with you, Crystal, and talk about the issue of homelessness. I know that the Baker administration created an interagency council. How has that work progressed, and the move to place families in supportive housing over motels and be more integrated in the community? How is that progressing, and what is your outlook on that?
Well, we've had great success. When we came into office, one of the governor and lieutenant governor's goals was to eliminate the use of hotel motels in the emergency assistance program. And we've done that, reduced the use of hotel motels by 97%. and at the same time reduce the overall EA caseload by over about 20%. And so part of how we started to think about this was, you know, how do you eat an elephant? Talk about an elephant. How do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. And so the first thing was, how do we figure out how to get folks to get the caseload to a place in which we felt more manageable and felt a little bit more like systems were sort of not out of control. And now we're going to be turning our attention to, well, how do we do the thing in which we say both, how do we keep people housed, right? Like, how do we keep people housed? Because what we understand, what we know is that it's not that you're paying 50%, you get evicted, and you end up in shelter. That's not what happens, right? Like, the event that causes you to become homeless is really probably 3 events before you end up at our door, because no one wants to go to shelter, right? Like, everybody thinks they can figure it out. It's the same kind of phenomenon that we see with foreclosure. And so by the time someone ends up in EA, they've got a whole lot of other things going on that we have to help deal with. So we're trying to figure out both how to kind of what we call upstream helping people, as opposed to making sure that people have to come to shelter in order to get help. And then once we permanently house folks, how do we have the right kinds of supports to do that? And so the idea is to, you know, spend money differently, as opposed to saying that we're going to deal with this. Sheila and I have talked a lot about what can we do, particularly with our subsidized housing inventory, to deal with evictions, right? And not to say, right, like I used to say when I ran Urban Edge to folks who were behind in their rent, like, you know, it's affordable housing, it's not free. If it was free, I would live here. And so, you know, we got to make sure that people have what they need, but it's also why mixed income housing becomes so important, you know, because people sort of vibe off of each other in the sense of when you get to a particular place, you can talk to your neighbor if you know them. It's like, oh, I lost my job. How do I get another job? Everybody helps with the kids. Like, it's really trying to build that kind of village thing in the sense that we have been missing. So we feel optimistic, as always, about our ability to move this forward, but we know it's not easy, right? And so we're going to continue to work together with all of our partners to do that.
Sheila, I know the city also has some pilot programs and otherwise to address this issue. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
The state's done a fabulous job working with the families, and we're going to be working on that eviction piece. I think we're actually even having a workshop in December about how to help folks avoid eviction. So we've been working on the individuals. We put together a plan a couple of years ago with all of our partners, and we looked at the whole system, and it was pretty fragmented, and it's working much, much better. And in the last 2 years, we've housed about 1,200 homeless individuals, and over 400 of those that have been homeless the longest, representing 3,000 homeless years, which is a number I just continues to increase, but it's a mind-boggling number. But what we've been doing is we've built an IT system that matches people that have been in shelter systems for really long periods of time with the right kind of units. We've been having housing surges. Maybe some of you have gone to them. They start at 5 a.m. where homeless people who have a really hard time navigating systems can come and do all of their paperwork in one morning and end up leaving with a unit, working really effectively with the BHA. We now, though, need to build, and they're doing it in the West Coast, larger supportive housing programs. And some of you might say it's concentration, but it actually is probably the only way to really have efficient service delivery with folks that need a lot of ongoing 24/7 services. So we're really starting to look at locations, working with the state on that now. So I think our next, our 2.0 on that will be looking at that kind of development, but also looking at the shelter system to see how they can be more nimble and react to people's needs more quickly. So we're really reducing the number of days that people spend in shelter. So there's a lot of good work, very innovative work going on in the shelter system and the homeless system right now in Boston.
Thanks. So you've heard enough from me. I want to open up the floor to questions. Also, I didn't mention earlier, we are live streaming this event, so we'll be taking questions from Twitter if they come in. I would ask you to remember that a question ends with a question mark and keep them brief. So start over here. Chris?
Metro Housing Boston.
Also, could you wait for the microphone, please, because we are recording this.
Chris Norris from Metro Housing Boston, and my question is actually for Barry and James, and the Undersecretary alluded to this in her first set of comments. I was wondering how the report defines working families and how the proposals and steps increase the housing supply for the significant number of working families who are either eligible for or receive rental assistance, yet have average incomes of only $15,000.
Well, we don't do a specific definition, but I think we're talking about people who probably are somewhere between 60% and 125% of area median income. We spent a lot of time in the report talking about how we could free up the older housing stock, which in the last 25 years was the housing stock that made it possible for them to live here, particularly in the inner core of Boston, Somerville, and Cambridge. So we started by saying, let's, in the short run, before we can build the villages, before we can find new ways of building housing that is affordable to working families in that range, can we free up some of the older housing stock by making housing available for those who have taken that stock over? I sometimes call it housing jujitsu, you know, using leverage in order to do that. But I'm also excited about some of the possibilities that Tamara and others have been talking about in terms of developing much higher productivity housing construction methodologies that would allow us to finally build new housing for working families in that income range. So it's going to be ultimately a combination of freeing up the older housing stock. Remember, that's still 40% of all the housing units are duplexes and triple deckers, and finding new ways of building housing that can be built at price points that working families in that income range can afford.
Yes, right here.
Bill Gates just bought 25,000 acres in Arizona with the intention of building a new city from the ground up, which is going to be a smart city and cutting edge in every respect. A facetious suggestion, but not entirely. Boston needs to find its own deca-billionaire who is motivated less by return than by the desire to transform what it means to be an urban metropolis for the 21st century. The question is, nobody mentioned autonomous driving, nobody mentioned smart city, nobody mentioned things that are kind of percolating in the marketplace that need to be part of this discussion.
I could maybe jump into that. You're right. I did not mention autonomous driving and the transportation innovations or disruptive technologies, and that is certainly one of them. I agree with you that, you know, we've been looking at the one in Toronto, which is by Google Sidewalk Labs, and it's definitely when you've got, you know, a good chunk of land, a couple hundred acres, and you can, and it's completely clear, and you can think about, you know, running an underground system where all of your services is done by robots, and up above it's only, you know, no private vehicles, and everything is prefab. Google it. It's a very interesting project. Again, if we had the kind of land and that kind of benefactor, then I agree with you. We would. I don't think that anybody up here would say no to that.
No, I do agree. I think there's one thing. I think we do need to get more intentional about the communities we want to build, right? And less. I'm going to wear the cement shoes now. Letting developers, you know, come and say and pitch. Sorry, but I think we need to say we really want our new communities to look like this, feel like this. House these folks. And, you know, and have these new technologies and innovations. So I like the thinking, and I think that our planning agency is getting better at that, but I think we have a ways to go.
And I will say that we think a lot about the voice that some of us represent in the administration is one that balances the technological innovations that are happening, right? And so we're in the middle of sort of a technological revolution that our kids are going to be reading about in history books, right? And so people talk a lot about autonomous cars and Uber and those kinds of things. And I'm sort of, and I'm always talking about, okay, so where does the Uber drivers, once you create an autonomous car, like what is that guy gonna do now, right? And how are we creating an economy intentionally to sort of retrain that? We all think, okay, well, they'll just find their place. Well, that isn't happening, and it hasn't happened, and it's part of why we're seeing what we're seeing on the national level, right? Because we don't think about the person, we think about the technology and the economy as if that's separate from people. And so like, and so at the end of the day, right, like we can't solve everything, and we're doing the best that we can with what we got, but technology is not a thing in and of itself. It's a thing that's supposed to help people live better. And if we forget about the people, then the technology just drives the kind of communities we have. And in older industrial, like in the Northeast, like we don't have 25 acres of land. We don't. And so like, we can't do that kind of thing. And so, but we do have to be more intentional about the communities that we build.
I think we might want to hear from an economist on this one. Barry?
So I just want to respond to this thing on transportation. James Usey, who was my co-author, co-developer of this report, and I are actually finishing a major report for another foundation, the Barr Foundation, specifically on transportation. And we know when we look at where people will likely be living, and because we're seeing the movement away from the inner core just for lower housing prices, that is causing the commuter disaster that we have now. So public transit becomes very important. I happen to be a strong supporter of North-South rail link. I think that's important. That's controversial, but I think that's going to be very important, particularly to put two labor markets, the North and South labor market, together. I think the other thing, and I just want to reinforce what everyone is saying here, we have been innovators in this country in all kinds of things, and most importantly, in housing over these years. It was the triple-decker that got invented here, the brownstone in New York. But the triple-decker was a new way of building housing specific for that demographic. And after World War II, we produced, Levittown. Not the greatest housing, but it fit that demographic revolution of young servicemen and women coming back, forming families, having kids very young. But now we have a totally new demographic, which is going to require a totally new form of housing in various places of various structures using all kinds of new techniques. And what this report calls for more than anything else is exactly what Joe Corcoran said. We need to get that collaborative together. It needs to have the leadership of the governor. It needs to have the leadership of political leaders. It needs business leadership from the Greater Boston Chamber of Commerce to the Mass Competitive Partnership. We've got to get everybody together, say, okay, what are all the pieces that need to be fixed? What are all the ideas we have? How can we put the pieces, the money, the people together to fix it now?
We have a question. No? Rachel? Wait, no, right behind.
Hi, Rachel Heller from CHAPA. Thank you. As always, this is a very helpful report, and we've heard a lot of great things this morning about innovations, about private capital and the importance of that. I want to go back to the report and the talk about zoning, because even if we have all of these great things coming together, we still have a huge problem with zoning. So I would love to hear from all of the panelists about the kinds of changes that are needed and what that impact would have.
Who wants to start?
I'll start. I mean, zoning is the be-all and end-all. I mean, a developer will go anywhere that it's zoned, and it doesn't take 10 years to get something approved. So the 40R in particular is a great program. It's voluntary. There's state support for communities who want to adopt it, and it works well. I mean, it's predictable. So zoning is key. Any developer wants to go where he's wanted, and zoning is part of demonstrating that you want someone. We don't like to fight, although we're always in fights, but that's not the way we want to. Our time is valuable. It costs you a lot of money to have a staff who's capable and has the sophistication to do these things, and you can't tie people up for 2 or 3 years fighting a community on zoning. So, so it's key. I mean, I think zoning is, it's the most important thing, one of the most important things in the whole conversation.
If I can jump in here too, that innovation competition, really the way that we started it was to say, let's suspend all zoning on this site. And the only way you can do that is when it's a pilot, right? Because you're experimenting. But I mean, everything from, the open space requirement per unit, the amount of parking spaces per unit, the, and compact living has a part to play here, because certainly, if our neighborhoods had their druthers, I think that they would end up doing form-based zoning, right? Which is to say, we like the scale of our communities the way they are. Maybe we give a little incentive to developers who are going to do a good thing, and they can go 1 or 2 stories higher, but not much more than that. What this competition showed was that in a 3-story building, as long as you were allowed to occupy more percentage of footprint of that site, you could get many more units, less parking, in the same amount of height and space, right? Which visually then for the neighborhood saves, gives them a sense that they've preserved the character. And so I think that there are some, to your point, like the zoning then, it's how do we circle back, and how do we work with the city and the state to make the zoning regulations support what we're finding in our little pilots?
I think that's right. I think we have to be, I like where Boston is headed. I like, let's dictate where we want good density near transit, and let's rezone or reaffirm the zoning in existing neighborhoods. I don't want developers coming in and saying, on behalf of the mayor's housing plan, we're going to tear down this block of single family homes and put up 40, 50, 60, 70 rather homely looking units. That's not what we want. We want to really strengthen existing neighborhoods and find areas where we can get good new density. And I think that's really, really important. And I think it's been a hard thing to message over the last couple of years, because every developer is out there saying, we need density. We need density, but we need it in the right places. I think as of right too is tough, because sometimes the as of right developments are dogs. The density is too low. There's parking. There's too much. So I think we need to actually be almost think about as of right with the proper densities too.
I want to balance this conversation. Not necessarily zoning outside of Boston is a way that many communities manage change, right? And at the end of the day, we want to make sure, like all of you, like in your neighborhoods and in your communities, want to have something to say about how you're managing change and growth. And so that is what zoning is about, and that is what I think philosophically is what's at the essence of the problem, right? Like, because people bought their house. Like, you don't know how many people I talk to who tell me they bought their house. And like, I had a woman in my office literally in tears crying because there was someone who was going to change the view from her kitchen window, right? And so like, this is like a really like deeply emotional kind of thing. Now, if we can have a conversation that's about, okay, well, here's the kind of community we want to change into, right? And part of what's happening now is with the technology, change is not happening gradually anymore. It's happening like that, right? And so, and people are having a hard time keeping up with that. And so, yes, we need zoning, but we need to think about how we're planning for that appropriately, and how we're, and like, you know, everybody's got to do their share, but making sure that, I agree with Sheila that we're not actually letting development opportunity drive where we're doing development, and how and what kinds of cities we're going to be in the 22nd century.
So, a related question for Sheila that I was wondering is, you know, the reduction in wait time for permit approval is impressive. Is that the result of a change of attitude? Is it a change of resources or process?
I think all of the above. The attitude was, you know, the mayor heard loud and clear that the permitting process was severely broken. We have a team that does nothing except look at data and do analytics on the data. They took a look at what was being installed, why it was being installed, where it was being installed. They've gotten a lot of good technology and IT folks in to look at the process. And they're analyzing it constantly. I mean, they brought in, you know, additional ZBA hearings, et cetera, et cetera. So I think it was analyzing the problem and then putting in some really, good new fixes. So the proof is in Barry's report. The times are way down. Community processes are still, they're still robust, and some of them are long and some of them are short. But once you're ready to go, you can get a permit pretty quickly.
Robust.
Robust. Engaged. Democracy.
So, sorry to keep you on the hot seat, but I know how much you love Twitter. And a question came in.
I do tweet.
How does the city meet the demand for affordable housing, not just in certain neighborhoods, but across the city?
So we are seeing, like as I mentioned earlier, we are creating more deed restricted. And the term affordable is tough, but more deed restricted units in our market rate developments than right now. We're creating affordable housing in more traditional methods, and a lot of that is downtown. So we're creating, hundreds and thousands of units in areas where we weren't able to create affordable housing given land values. So that's a good thing. So there's a lot of mixed income because of the inclusionary development policies that have been improved through the BPDA. And then, we're looking for opportunities. We're looking for opportunities in the Fenway and the North End and, downtown and Charlestown and where we have public housing. So we are looking at how to create affordable housing in every neighborhood. Yes, some neighborhoods are more difficult than others, but I think if you look at our pipeline, you'll see a good cross-section of affordable, more deeply affordable housing in most neighborhoods.
Okay. We have a question
over here.
Third row.
Hi, Jeanette Callahan from Greater Boston Interfaith Organization. Hi, how are you doing, Sheila? Any ideas and innovative thinking around the use of the 225 acres of Long Island? Maybe get some colleges and universities to send their students over to, live there.
Yeah. I mean, as the bridge came down, it's got a price tag of well over $100 million. I know there's a lot of people at the city talking about it, but it's premature for me to say anything. But certainly it's a city asset that I know the mayor wants to see used again. But more to come. I think more to come fairly soon.
Okay. Right here.
Hi, Jake Grossman with the Grossman Companies. I guess I have a distinction that we've built a large modular project in the city, and I don't think it's the saving grace that people are discussing here. It's certainly a benefit, and I'm intrigued how you guys are all working together. But I think what Barry mentioned about transportation, I guess I'm curious, are the housing folks working with the transportation team at the city and state level in a holistic manner to figure out how to create affordable housing and improving rapid transit?
Yeah, yes, we are. In fact, the governor has an initiative called Open for Business, in which we meet regularly with transportation folks, with the Department of Capital Asset Management, and other folks. And we don't think about, again, we don't think about how to create affordable housing. We think about how to create housing, right? And what we can do to make sure that it's at, how much we can do to make sure it's at particular price points. And that's not always, like, we're not always, able to give away land. Because, the state does have its own kind of financial challenges as well. And in the same way that you all use your own real estate as an asset, like the state has to think like that, and the city has to think like that to some degree as well. And so we spend a lot of time thinking really, and not just in Boston, but across the state, right? Because if we have significant transportation investments, one of the ways transportation works better is if you increase ridership, right? And so the idea that you can build housing around existing transportation assets, we spend a lot of time thinking about that and how to do that.
We have time for one last question here to my left. Tamara, did you want to add to that?
I was going to add to it. I think that it's great that you're pointing out the intersection between transportation and housing. And I am teaching this class at Mass Art, and lot of graduate students coming from many different places to try to get into the city, but living, not able to afford to live here. And their commute times are horrendous, and it's sort of that movie like Cars, Trains, and, like every sort of possible vehicular method to get into the city. And the cost of that alone in time and then in price is really high. And I do think having you all here is so great that, like, could we think bigger as a state? And there used to be this notion of the urban ring, but maybe that's not the right ring. But is there a ring? Like, now you could take the commuter rail out to Worcester, and it might take you less time than living in some of our ring cities around Boston, right? So if we step back and look from the state perspective and say, you could create a sort of, swath of real estate land all around the city that's easier to get into the city than living here, and it could be more affordable, it could be intentional. I really feel like that's what they do in Europe, that's what they do in Asia. Let's do it. Let's have those big conversations and then try to figure out, how do we get the infrastructure money to support that, because in the long term, that's what's going to help us, not focusing on the same dirt in the city that we keep focusing on and saying to Mayor Walsh, it's all it's his problem to solve.
Okay. Time for one last brief question.
Thank you very much. My name is Isa Zimmerman, and I happen to be serving on the board of the Massachusetts Association for Housing Cooperatives, which is a term that has not been at all mentioned in this wonderful discussion. Thank you. So the question is, what do you see as the role of and the importance of housing cooperatives in Boston and surrounding communities as we go forward?
Boston I love cooperatives. I think cooperatives, we need thousands of co-op units. You heard it here. We put out funding every couple times a year. We say priority for co-ops, and we don't have a response. I'm really glad that the co-ops in Boston are getting organized, or actually in the state, and they really are sort of demanding this as a model that we should embrace. So I stand at the ready to serve in any way that I can. I think as home ownership gets really harder and harder for people, let's figure out a way to buy existing buildings or create new buildings and have them cooperatively owned. I think it's long overdue.
Thank you. So would you please join me in thanking this wonderful panel? And now I'd like Paul Grogan to come up and give some closing remarks.
My reaction is wow. Incredible talent on display here, both in terms of the scholarship that was the reason for us gathering. Barry, I know you think this is the best one ever, and I totally agree. So thank you all for being part of this. We clearly have a big problem, but as Tamara said, let's do it. I think there are lots of reasons to be optimistic. I mean, one is just the talent that's been on display in our four guests, but the talent that is in this room is just incredible. And I've had a front row seat for a lot of years, and I just think there's never been this assemblage of talent. I go back a way. Some of you will remember that once upon a time, Amy Anthony was Crystal and I was Sheila. But the reason I say that is... It is. The reason I say that, though, is we kind of take for granted we have extraordinary state-local cooperation, particularly state Boston cooperation, even though you have leaders of different parties. And that is not something that has been there the whole way. And it just permits a level of thinking and doing that that's at another level. So I really want to congratulate the governor and the mayor and his top appointees in this area for the environment that they've created. The other thing we have going for us is that we have created, and fate has also created, Boston now is one of the most vital and dynamic cities in the world. It's just incredible what's going on in this city. And we see that some of the problem we talked about today is a byproduct of the success we're having. But I would rather have that problem than what we had in 1975 when I started with this, where you had a city hemorrhaging population and jobs to the suburbs, pervasive pessimism about the urban future. Kevin White and Jim Rouse unable to raise financing for Faneuil Hall Marketplace in the city from any financial institution. The pessimism was so complete. We are in a very, very different place, and I would much rather have the problems we have today than those. Great victories have been won, and part of that is the renaissance of urban values. Again, part of that is the problem because everybody wants to be here, but that is so good for our civilization in so many ways. It's so good for the environment, it's so good for the arts, and a million things we could talk about. It's good for our civilization. The foundation, as many of you know, has been involved in, and we're very proud to say this, in seeding much of the housing and community development infrastructure that exists and that all of you represent. We're very proud of that, everything from CHAPA to the Metropolitan Housing Partnership, the CDCs, and all the rest. So we are going to remain deeply committed to this area. There are some fascinating ideas in the report that we're going to be thinking hard about, and we will be back to you. But thank you so much for being here, and we look forward to continuing the struggle and continuing. And speaking of struggle, one thing we can do now that's very important is we need to defend what we have, the housing credit being the most important thing under threat nationally. And locally, let's get that zoning legislation passed. It's already through the Senate. Let's get it passed. Let's go do that. Let's do it, as Tamara said. Thank you.